In my recent video speech, entitled "What Do We Know About Chemtrails?", I explained the three grand objectives of chemtrails: climate change mitigation, depopulation, and missile defense. I also explained what they're spraying, namely coal ash, aerosolized metals, and Welsbach materials. In my video speech entitled "Who is responsible for chemtrails?", I explained that the heads of state of the G20 nations are responsible for the decision to chemtrail our skies, and that NATO merely carries out an executive-level decision. Why the G20? Well, because their economies account for 85% of the gross world product, 80% of world trade, and 2/3 of the world population. In other words, they are largely responsible for polluting the planet. In this speech, I want to explain the climate change mitigation aspect, which is by far the most important reason why our skies are being chemtrailed. How did chemtrails come to be? Chemtrails are the result of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, an international treaty adopted in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro and entered into force in 1994. Its objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous man-made damage to the climate system. Chemtrails started in 1995, a year after enough nations ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But since this treaty did not set binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions and had no enforcement mechanism, there was no pressure to do much about global warming, which is why few countries chemtrailed, and those that did, like the US, used them sparingly and more as a test than anything else. The Kyoto Protocol of 1997, however, established legally binding obligations for developed nations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2008 to 2012. And chemtrails increased accordingly in the US and started being used by most developed nations. Each nation, however, chemtrailed as much or as little as it decided to, because their climate change mitigation efforts were to be nationally determined, and there was no international pressure to reach a certain target. Chemtrails picked up even more once the Cancun Agreement was signed in 2010, which stated that future global warming should be limited to below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. They increased because pressure on developed nations increased also to do something to compensate for the greenhouse gases they pump into the atmosphere because they are heavily industrialized. And since they could not limit their greenhouse gas emissions fast enough, they used chemtrails to buy time and mitigate for their high greenhouse gas emissions. But chemtrails really exploded in 2015 after the Paris Agreement was signed and countries became legally bound to meet their nationally determined contributions to prevent climate change. And they reached the insufferable level of today in 2016, once the Paris Agreement entered into force and every country has to live up to its nationally determined targets, which are no longer just intended targets, but clearly set and therefore written in stone. What is climate change mitigation? Actions that limit the severity of long-term climate change. Such actions could be phasing out fossil fuels and switching to low-carbon energy sources such as renewables, expanding forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, increasing energy efficiency, and of course climate engineering, thus chemtrails. What is climate engineering or geoengineering, you ask? It is a deliberate and large-scale intervention in the Earth's climatic system with the aim of limiting adverse global warming. In other words, it is a strategy to prevent the climate from changing from the current stable state to an unstable state in the near future, which would make agriculture nearly impossible and therefore would spell the end of our civilization. So it is not a method to change the climate, but to prevent the climate from changing. Who chemtrails and who doesn't? Well, the short answer is that developed nations chemtrail while developing nations don't. The long answer is that all 28 nations that are NATO members chemtrail, along with many of NATO's 41 nations that are part of the Partnership for Peace program. Why, you ask? Why must developed nations chemtrail their skies? Because it is developed nations that are responsible for pumping the bulk of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And since they are responsible for creating the problem in the first place, the negotiators of these climate accords decided, rightfully, that it is only fair that they should also be responsible for solving the problem, or at least for buying us time until we figure out a way to get rid of these greenhouse gases that we have already pumped into the atmosphere. So you see, during these difficult international negotiations, developed nations said to developing nations, if you industrialize to our level and pump as many greenhouse gases per capita into the atmosphere as we do, then the planet will be fried. To which the developing nations replied, so you want us not to industrialize and not to grow as rich as you because you have already damaged the planet for all of us? You created this problem, you solve it. You put all these greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, you pay for the damage. You have the technology, know-how and resources necessary to at least slow down global warming while we industrialize, and do so by bypassing fossil fuels and going directly to renewable sources, which is expensive. So you pay to slow down global warming. And since developed nations could not dispute the validity of the accusations levied by developing nations, they started chemtrailing the hell out of our skies to buy time, so the planet does not heat up by 2 degrees Celsius, which would cause the sea level to rise and would drown the world's 52 island nations, as well as many low-lying coastal areas around the world. In addition to which, it would cause drought and floods and extreme weather events throughout the world, causing catastrophic damage and making life miserable and downright impossible in sensitive areas of the world where life has never been easy. So chemtrailing is in essence an act of sympathy and compassion towards those people and nations who suffer most and have had the least to gain from our posh, industrialized and consumption-heavy lifestyles. And if I hear the argument that corporations are to blame for the destruction of the environment one more time and for overconsumption, I'm going to strangle someone. Corporations manufacture goods that we all consume, so we are all guilty in equal measure for the destruction of the planet, which is why we are all being made to pay for it by being forced to inhale the industrial waste they spray on us. Because we live in a world where political decisions are made by consensus at the international level, and because chemtrails are a climate change mitigation measure, the nations responsible for pumping the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere must chemtrail their skies the most to compensate for the damage they do. To what extent do nations chemtrail? Well, the more industrialized a nation is, the more it must chemtrail. In other words, they must chemtrail in direct proportion to the greenhouse gases they pump into the atmosphere. That is why the US, Canada, Germany, Holland, the UK, France, Italy and Belgium chemtrail the most. They pollute the most, so they must chemtrail the most. The heavier a country's carbon footprint is, the more it must chemtrail. But also, the richer a country is, the more it must chemtrail, whereas poor countries don't have to chemtrail at all. This is in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Common but differentiated responsibilities is a principle of international environmental law which says that all states are responsible for addressing global environmental destruction, but not equally responsible. The principle balances, on the one hand, the need for all states to take responsibility for global environmental problems, and on the other hand, the need to recognize the wide differences in levels of economic development between states. These differences, in turn, are linked to the states' contributions to, as well as their abilities to address these problems. This principle was formalized in international law at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Once a nation reaches sustainability, it will be able to stop chemtrailing, and no one will be able to force it to continue. This is partially why developed nations are going full steam ahead towards renewables. It is the light at the end of the tunnel. Now you know.